the most improved offensive line in 2023 will be that and more this week on the couch. Football Guys, offensive line expert, former college offensive lineman, draft daddy Matt Bitonti here. The most improved offensive line in 2023 will be
The Baltimore Ravens is a good choice, getting healthy on the tackles. I also like the idea of the Giants' offensive line. They've gotten a lot better too.
yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the Ravens because I think this can break either way, right? Ronnie Stanley and Morgan Moses, these guys that can absolutely give them one of the better and certainly one of the most experienced offensive tackle combos in the league. You're having this changeover to Todd Monken's offense. There's going to be more passing. There's going to be more tempo. How do you feel like Stanley and Moses project in that kind of change, or how instrumental are they to the success or early success of that change?
So yeah, I mean, Stanley is definitely the key to the rankings. He's playing left tackle. There's a real question of is he the same player that he used to be? And when I'm setting these grades up, I don't have any film to look at the beginning of the year. But if we assume that Stanley gets back to at least a semblance of his former Pro Bowl self, and you have Kevin Zeitler at right guard also putting in a Pro Bowl shift, and then Morgan Moses, who's good but not necessarily great, but very reliable. Those three guys could all go over the hill tomorrow, and my prediction
Right.
looks like garbage. But there's also the situation where veterans play better than rookies. You don't necessarily want to have a rookie center like you did last year with Linderbaum, and now he's coming back for a second year. Ben Cleveland is settling in at left guard. They're a big group, big in terms of heaviness. They're one of the heaviest lines in the league. Filele is their swing tackle. That guy is almost 400 pounds. It's just a good, hard running group. Joel D'Alessandris, is a line coach. I think they have a lot to like, but it all depends on do these aged veterans sort of hold up under pressure.
Yeah, this is the sexier version of the Jets line, I guess, because and then we're going to get into a lot of Jets misery. If Matt Patonti's on the show, we're going to get a lot of Jets misery. We don't have to jump right to the Jets misery, but
Please.
you set it up really well. I think just like a lot of our preseason fantasy football, uh, our preparation, and we have to draft, so we have to take stands. When you draft players, you take stands, but just familiarizing yourself with the range of outcomes really helps you be agile and responsive in the season, especially in that first month of the season when the new reality presents itself. Like you said, there's no tape to go on. Well, we start getting like real tape to go on in September. And on one hand, you have Baltimore as a team. I would say, in addition to Greg Roman, the offensive line the last few years has not been a positive for them. But if it becomes a positive with good health from these veterans, like you said, now you have an extra added level of improvement that maybe gives you more of a reason to focus on Lamar Jackson or J.K. Dobbins if he's healthy, or whatever receiver you like, or Mark Andrews. But like you said, the first few weeks, Stanley's not himself. Moses gets banged up, Zeitler gets banged up, then we maybe need to be open to this offense underperforming. You mentioned the Giants. Giants in the news with Andrew Thomas getting an extension, offensive linemen getting paid where running backs aren't. But and Evan Neal entering year two, Brian Dable's offense in year two. I love, by the way, that we're going to talk offensive line coaches. More people need to know the names of offensive line coaches. I remember that one year that Dante Scarnecchio wasn't the coach of the Patriots offensive line. You see it. You saw it right away, right? Offensive line coaches matter. Let's talk about the Giants and the possibility that they're part of a continued renaissance for this offense.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Andrew Thomas is like the man. He's first team All Pro. That was an outstanding pick. He earned that money. Evan Neal on the other side is more of a question mark, but I have him as a good grade. Like, he's a little bit better at running a pass than run blocking than pass blocking, but he's a good right tackle, not necessarily below average. Whether that lives up to draft status or not is like a different question. They have a new center, um, JMS, Michael Schmitz or whatever, and we were talking before about running teams and teams that like to run and how that running mindset can, make life easier for an offensive line. And then you look at teams like the Eagles, who, don't worry, I'm going to double back to New York in a second, but the Eagles are number one, and they do these quarterback sneaks and they push the line. And I could see a situation in Baltimore where they'll push Lamar over the line, from 2 yards out, or the Giants as well with Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones is a big dude. They're not scared of him getting hurt on rushing. So when you have these bigger lines, and you have a person to run behind like Thomas, and you have a person to run behind like Landon Dickerson and Jordan Mailata, and hopefully Ronnie Stanley or Zeitler. You find your best run blocking lineman, and you put the quarterback beneath them, and then you shove the blocking backs into the quarterback's back, and it's like, if they're not going to make it illegal, I think a lot of teams are going to start doing this, and it's going to affect touchdown vulturing. It's going to affect all sorts of fantasy things.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Just from a real basic 30,000 foot perspective, we always hear that it's a copycat league. And what I like about that idea is, yeah, the NFL's kind of like this laboratory where whatever works proliferates itself, right? And whatever doesn't work just extinguishes itself. And the copycat league label embraces that idea. And like you said, this play's working so easily. Well, this is something that's going to spread. And because let's face it, being able to convert touchdowns from the one, it's not a given. And if teams can find easier ways to do that, then why not? If it eliminates one play where you fumble at the one or get stopped on 4th and 1, that can be one win, which can be the difference between going to the playoffs and not going to the playoffs. And I think another important part of this analysis that you put in there is Daniel Jones. I know when we were talking about this before we went live, Matt, you mentioned Anthony Richardson with Indianapolis. These bigger quarterbacks, especially, teams aren't going to be. I even think of Taysom Hill. He's cheap at tight end. Uh, he makes a lot of sense to use in the same role where you may get, and Taysom Hill is already getting. And arguably, they were already doing this with Taysom Hill, but this just gives them another way to deploy him at the goal line. So I think you're right to bring that up in conjunction with the Giants. You mentioned the rookie center for the Giants. I just want to throw the floor open because you're the draft daddy. We met a long time ago now, like 16 years ago or so, on the road at the All-Star games. Felix's Fish Camp out there in Mobile.
Another lifetime
Another
ago.
lifetime ago, but in this lifetime, you still love offensive line play and scouting these players. Any hot takes or anything that stood out from this year's rookie class as you watch the draft unfold or as you watch the players getting prepared, getting familiar with them? If you saw a player go to a team, you thought that's great, that's a great fit for what they care about in their offensive line play. What stood out to you when you look back at the 2023 NFL draft and offensive linemen?
So to the Giants, John Michael Schmitz, he's the most pro ready of the
Mm-hmm.
centers, but he's not necessarily the best physical attributes of the
Mm-hmm.
centers. But in terms of fantasy, that's unless you're in a dynasty league, you want the guy that's ready now. Joe Tippmann on the Jets would probably be a better guy for next
Mm-hmm.
year. They might give him a red shirt like how they did Cam Jurgens in Philadelphia. I mean, I get feedback from people and they say, "Why isn't my team ranked higher? We just drafted this guy," and it's like teams that draft a guy at 14 like Broderick Jones, or they aren't necessarily going to be ranked highly. It's admitting I have a problem with my offensive line and I need to fix it. And there's definitely a chance for the Giants went from 32 last year to 20 this year. It's a huge jump. They're still not top 10, but they're getting there. So in this draft, I liked the pick of Darnell Wright for the Bears in terms of being pro ready, right tackle. You throw him in there with Nate Davis, another sort of like quarterback sneak
Yeah.
friendly offense. And to talk about that for a second, I was looking at Cleveland, who by the way have a great offensive line. They're ranked fourth, and they would use guys who are linemen as blocking fullbacks. Can you imagine the tush push play with the quarterback being pushed by a backup
Mm-hmm.
lineman? A Michael Dunn or a James Hudson. It's like now you're looking at it like it's almost becoming like a rugby scrum
Mm-hmm.
where this thing can just move and you can get two. I mean, you could even get 2 point conversions out of it. I looking at the Super Bowl, the Eagles got in from the two, against the Chiefs, and everybody knew it was
Right.
coming, and it was automatic. But yeah, I like the guys in the draft, But I don't think when a team takes a guy in the draft, that's not necessarily saying it's going to be a good line this year. I think these guys often need a year or two to round out. I mean, I liked Paris Johnson going to Arizona, but I don't think Arizona is going to be a good line. You know what I
Right.
mean? So it's like I like a lot of the individual prospects. The system matters. I mean, Atlanta's system helps those guys. So Matthew Bergeron might be an amazing pick at left guard out of Syracuse,
Mhm.
um, because of how he fits that system. Would that same player be an amazing pick for Detroit or Dallas? Maybe not. It depends on what the fit is between the player and the system.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points about are players pro ready or are they being drafted for their traits and their ceiling? And absolutely, that we need to tap the brakes a little bit on the idea that taking an offensive lineman in the first round means the offensive line is going to be improved in year one. But you mentioned, I want to go back to a couple of offensive lines you mentioned. You mentioned Chicago and Darnell Wright. I think a lot was made rightfully of how he performed against Will Anderson, who went a lot higher in the draft, and he should slot in. He's definitely pro ready. And I'm looking at the Bears, and I feel like the Bears have been a team that we look at the offensive line as a detriment, as an obstacle to their success. And Matt, it feels like this year, maybe at the very least, it's not a negative. And as the year goes on, it could turn into a positive.
Yeah, I mean, last year I had the Bears all the way at the bottom of my most underrated lines, and they were 29th. And I'm saying they're 29th, but they have all these guys like Braxton Jones at left tackle is a very interesting dude, especially in run blocking. Um, they took Tevin Jenkins, who was kind of a disaster at all these positions, and they moved him to guard. He looks good at guard, and then they move him to left guard. Cody Whitehair at center, established dude. Nate Davis from
Yeah.
Tennessee. He's a hardcore run blocker. And then Darnell Wright. Now that's like a good five. Larry Barham's your swing. Like Lucas Patrick. They've got some decent depth. Again, like it's almost like picking a stock or
Hmm.
something, and you're checking in year five. I mean, or a startup or something like this. Like, this was a ground floor rebuilding operation, but now you're getting sort of, Juan Castillo, 20th year in the
Yeah.
league, offensive line coach. He's starting to put his pieces together. He's starting to cook with a little sauce. Does that mean that, like, if we had a pass blocking discussion, we could rip this unit
Right.
apart?
Right.
But in the hypothetical run blocking world, yes, they're better going forward than they're going backward. They're big. Tevin Jenkins was a very like sort of mediocre pick in terms of how he played, but he's still an aggressive dude. He just didn't have the feet for tackle. But you put him inside, and you're like, okay, I get it. I understand what they're thinking about here.
Yeah. It's like that old idea about you don't draft guards because you can just draft tackles. If they don't work out, you got a guard. But yeah. And again, what I like about your analysis there is, hey, if you make this a pass blocking unit, if you're looking at them through that lens, you're not going to be happy. But the Bears' philosophy on offense doesn't really depend that much on the quality of their pass blocking. It's not a drop back passing offense. So, and I mean, let's face it, and sometimes the way it works out with a player like Justin Fields is early pressure can be lethal for the defense. It can actually be something that
Right,
opens the barn door and creates a
right.
big run with a player like Justin Fields. It's really just like play action passing, like with the passing where the run sets up the pass that is, I think, more important to their offense, or even a moving pocket roll Justin Fields out than having him do a 7-step drop. That's not really their offense. So who cares? It actually shows to me rational team building, right? That you're building an offensive line, and that's a whole other level to what you do, Matt. That I think is underrated. Is you can compare these teams' offensive lines in a vacuum as if you were starting a team. If you were starting a team with this 5 or this 7, how would you rate them against each other? But it's in the context of how these teams believe you win football games and their playbook and so on, and their other personnel. You mentioned Atlanta is a good one. And I think, yeah, I'll just tee it up this way with Atlanta. I think Atlanta's offensive line is one of the reasons that it's okay to take Bijan Robinson in the first round of your fantasy draft. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like Chris Lindstrom at right guard is really coming into his own. You know, he made the Pro Bowl last year. He's good in both phases. He's a very polarizing player among the offensive line press. Some people think he's amazing. Some people wouldn't want him on their team at all. But in this particular system, he's really good. Jake Matthews is underrated. You slide in Bergeron, Drew Dalman at center. He beat out Matt Hennessy, who was the draft pick, and he's a better run blocker. You know, I think maybe Caleb McGarry at right tackle is maybe your weak spot. You could maybe upgrade on him. But, you know, there's all these guys kicking around, and that sort of zone system is like really fits these attributes of these guys. You know, agility, getting to the second level. There's not a lot of injury risk there. These guys tend to play every game. I mean, that's really the X factor is keeping guys
Mhm,
healthy. They signed Ethan Greenidge, who's actually a very like underrated sort of do it all guy for the Saints last
mhm.
year. When the Saints lost a lot of guys, they lose Andrews Pete, they lose Cesar Ruiz, they lose McCoy. Greenidge is getting a lot of snaps from last year. That was a good like I don't know if he'll challenge anybody for a starting position, but it's good to have options.
Yeah, and, injuries, and this is one and, by the way, if you folks don't know, again, subscribe to Football Guys. If you listen this far into offensive line discussion, you're the football nerd like us, and subscribe, or at the very least, sign up for our free email newsletter if you haven't. But you're gonna get Matt's takes on offensive line, and like you said, at some point during the season, Matt, what's going to be important isn't analyzing the five, it's knowing how good is six and seven, and for some of these teams, probably eight and nine. And that's actually going to be more important to understanding the fantasy implications of offensive line play than just where we're at right now, where we're evaluating these offensive lines in a static way and just projecting as if they're all going to play 17 games. But we know with the brutality of the position that's not even going to be remotely close to happening. And that's why, like we've talked about at the top with Baltimore, we can do this analysis of what Baltimore's offensive line is going to do for their offense if everyone stays healthy. But we should be ready to pivot and understand how big is the drop off if these guys can't stay healthy. Um, I want to go back to you mentioned the Steelers. So,
Yeah.
Jets were probably going to wallow. The Steelers, I try to be optimistic. I try to be optimistic at this time of year. Okay, you mentioned, and I think this fits into one of your earlier points about Broderick Jones. That it sounds like if you're listening, what's coming out of Pittsburgh, that Dan Moore actually was one of the most improved players in the spring. And if Dan Moore starts, that's not necessarily an indictment of Jones as a pick. And especially when you add in your analysis that, hey, don't expect that these guys, and Jones was more of a trait based first round pick than a pro ready based first round pick. Um, so, but the Steelers, I think the reason for hope there, other than this news about Dan Moore, uh, is the interior offensive line. And what's funny is they threw picks at the interior offensive line. None of the picks really worked, but the free agents they picked up from the scrap heap, guys like James Daniels, one of the Bears cast off, and this year they got Siamalu. Uh, now they have something to build around on the offensive line. So is this another offensive line where we're looking at improvement, not necessarily getting into the top half of the league, but getting out of the basement?
So yeah, I mean Dan Moore, man. I mean, again, I'm setting these lineups, these
Mm-hmm.
models in June. I mean, I'm thinking to myself, what is this lineup going to be? And you think they took Broderick Jones at 14, they have to start him, right? But Dan Moore was great at left tackle, and he was really. I'm not going to say like a Pro Bowl snub, but he's like in that
Wow.
conversation of that's how good he was at the spot. And then you're thinking to yourself, well, Chuck's Okorafor is like a natural right tackle. And it's like, where's Broderick Jones play? Well, it doesn't matter. If these guys are better, eventually they'll figure out the best five, you
Mm-hmm.
know? But in terms of my model loves cohesion. So if you actually moved more back to to left tackle and then in made it last year's lineup, their ranking would be probably in the mid 20s instead of at 27 with all this change. Sumalo is a great pickup at left guard. That was like a really key underrated move. Can Sumalo, Mason Cole, and James Daniels as an interior three is pretty darn
Yeah.
solid. I'm not going to say best in the league, but top five, top 10 is easily. Um, and I actually like Dan Moore, and Dan Moore was great last year. These are one of these guys that most casual guys. You say see a casual fan, Dan Moore is, but I guarantee every Steelers fan knows who Dan Moore is.
Yeah, and even though Broderick Jones, what's fascinating to me as a Steelers fan, I don't feel like the Steelers have ever had a left tackle like him. I'm just trying to even rack my brain. I mean, Max Starks was kind of athletic, but nothing like Jones. It's interesting too to have Jones and Washington, who played next to each other a lot, reunited, but may not be much for this year, which might not be a bad thing for the Steelers.
I mean, could we just stop for a
Yeah,
second and say, the whole spring, I've been waiting for someone to tell me this. Like, what if Washington is your left
right.
tackle?
Hey,
I,
well,
I mean, I'm not saying he's a bad tight end or anything like that, but I'm telling you, somewhere there's an offensive line coach who's like,
yeah,
yeah, let's get this guy and let's move him to left tackle. And even if you're his agent, you're like, well, the money is way better at left
then a
tackle
tight
than it is
end.
at
Yeah,
tight end.
yeah.
I mean, again, I don't want to say anything bad. Actually, Broderick Jones was tied to the Jets for a
Yep.
lot of the process. So I'm very familiar with this player. I think he was always a little raw
Mhm.
for what the Jets are on this 1 year timeline or whatever, this 2 year timeline. I always thought he was a little raw in terms of like you bring in Aaron Rodgers and you also going to start this rookie and this other rookie at center. Like, are they going to hold their water during his notorious hard counts and such? And all of his audibles, he wants to be like Peyton Manning part two. So it's like sometimes the veterans, but now with Pittsburgh, you're growing with Pickett. The skill positions are drool
Mhm.
worthy. I mean, you have George Pickens, all these guys with the skills. It's reasonable to have some optimism. It really is. And we talk about injury and such, and like they signed Nate Herbig,
Oh,
another
yeah.
former Jet. Like that guy played a lot for them. He played a lot. He was basically a starter. Like he's turned himself into a real starter. And to have a guy like that on the bench, you know, I have optimism that they will rise in the rankings, assuming they don't get hurt or some decimated by some crazy thing. But yeah, that's a team that's going to be better than they are just based on the fact that Sumalo will settle in, and if Jones starts, he'll start to settle in. Whatever. Once they settle these lineups up, there's like upside, like a natural upside in the
Yeah,
rankings.
the Herbig gave the Steelers 3 sets of brothers. 3. They have 3 sets of brothers on their team, which is just unreal. I have to think that's never happened in the NFL before, right? To have 3 guys.
I love the brothers. I love Quinnen and Quincy
Sure.
Williams. I feel like if you're gonna have a locker room,
Yeah.
throw some brothers in there. There's this whole idea about 45 and 8, meaning like you have your 8 super expensive stars, and the other 45 are like interchangeable in a way. And in that sense, the other 45, let's hope that they have good locker room
Yeah.
chemistry. And who would you rather fight for than your brother?
Yeah, and the Steelers actually in recent years have had 5 different sets of brothers. For the folks that aren't familiar, of course, Derek and T.J. Watt. Congratulations on a retirement for J.J. Watt, future Hall of Famer J.J. Watt. Cameron and Connor Hayward. There's actually some buzz about Connor Hayward. I wouldn't be shocked if he got a few touches out of the backfield as a runner. And Cameron Hayward is quickly putting his name high on the list of all-time Steelers.
I'm still sore that the Jets passed on Cam Hayward for Muhammad Wilkerson. That's
Wilkerson
how
was
that's how
good
old
at first.
I am.
Wilkerson looked like he was going to be a player at first, but
Yeah, but it wasn't Ironhead Hayward's son.
yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, Ironhead Hayward. It's like he got us all to use that little poofy thing in the shower, right? Terrell and Trey Edmonds, and then Carlos and Khalil Davis. That one's a little more under the radar. But yeah, some Steelers offensive line improvement. We're talking about optimism, right? I want to gauge your pessimism or see if you are as pessimistic as I am about Tennessee. When I look at Tennessee's offensive line, you want to, I'm not saying the list can be 0, but you want to at least go through the exercise of are there any teams where catastrophically bad offensive line play could just keep the the offense like in a ditch on the side of the road? And I wonder, is Tennessee one of those candidates with the players they've lost? And then you have Nicholas Petit Frere, who at least worked out, maybe not as well as like the Seattle rookies worked out, but worked out as a rookie starter for them last year. Now he's going to miss 6 games. What's your pessimism factor measure on the Titans?
So, I mean, especially early on, you nailed it with the Nicholas Petit Fair. I don't get a lot of news in July or early July, but that was to have your only decent returner be suspended for their gambling policy is really a bad. is bad news. And in terms of tiers, like I have 31 is Arizona, and then 32 is Tennessee, and it's a full point and a half
Oh,
lower. And that's even not even counting the when a team gets to 32, I don't just keep downgrading them. Like you're at 32, but the score will be lower when you factor in the gambling suspension. Now, all that being said, I like Andre Dillard. I think he's a good finesse pass blocker. I really like Peter Skoronsky. He's
yeah,
probably one of the best linemen in the entire draft. In terms of instant impact and just what he did on Saturdays. Brunskill's a decent guy. Aaron Brewer's in the system at center. I don't know who the right tackle is going to be now, but yeah, no, it's problematic, dude. There's a lot of change. They changed their all line coach. They changed all sorts of stuff in Tennessee, and things like that can take a while to weave it back together.
hmm,
Especially when other teams are coming in loaded for bear. You got to keep it into context. Why are they bad? Well, compared to the
yeah,
best, and then where they have the top five, and they've got starters that are on the bench, and they've got pipeline guys, and they have 10 deep, and then you have Tennessee, and you're like, I don't fully know what this lineup is going to be. That's a
yeah.
problem. So yeah, they're my last place line, and it's not even close. They would be on their own little tier
Yeah.
if we did
Yeah,
tiers.
really like bringing up the rear. So we'll see. Although every time I do the Titans analysis, Matt, I always come back to Mike Vrabel teams overachieve. They just and it almost feed off of hearing us say stuff like this about them. But there's only so much you can do with grit and intensity and determination. It's
And I like Peter Skoronsky. Let it be.
yeah,
Let the
yeah,
record show. I am a
yeah.
big buyer on Peter
Yeah,
Skoronsky.
and I mean that is a guy. I remember when the Steelers had David DeCastro fall to them, and the Titans getting a player like Skronsky, it's a band aid, more than a band aid. Maybe a splint or crutches or something where it's going to help them get through rough times. I guess let's stay on the negative side, and let's go ahead and dive into the Jets here, because I guess the question here is you know, I mean, if I put an over under of like 20 combined games played for Brown and Becton this year, would you? I mean, maybe it's not fair to ask you this question because as a Jets fan, you're scarred, you're traumatized. But I guess do you think it could get better? Are we? I mean, at least looking at maybe using 3 tackles or 4 this year instead of 6. And how important is it to Hackett and Rogers and everything they're going to try to do this year?
So I've gone over this Jets lineup 1,000 times in my head, and I still don't fully know who the starters are going to be at tackle. And that's probably the number one reason why you're wondering, why did the Jets ranked 23rd or 24th? If you don't know who your tackles are going to be, and it's July 26th, that's a big problem. And I can tell you from camp, Dwayne Brown's been on the
Yeah.
pup. He's just getting back into it. A second about Brown. He's the oldest lineman in the league by 2 years. He's 2 years older than Jason Kelsey. Okay. He's had a torn rotator cuff for the better part of those 2 years. Now, nobody's doubting the man's toughness, but there's a price to be paid for that. When you play through, you at the very least, you're not getting stronger. You're not lifting weights. You're not in any kind of upper body shape because you're just going from game to rehab to shoot me up for the game again. And the damage gets done there. There's a real chance that either Brown or Becton won't be on this roster day one because Brown, you can save like $6 million by cutting him. I don't know what the Aaron Rodgers deal is that they just pulled off, but they just got announced they redid his contract again. But if the Jets need cap room, Dwayne Brown is a target. Becton, everybody is challenging him. He's like on a pitch count, depending on who you talk to. He's getting beat by this person and that person. The New York media is up this guy's rear end right now. He is getting dogpiled on real hard. Part of that is his own doing with the social media. I think there's a case you can make that Elijah Vera Tucker is actually your best tackle on the roster, and you could move him out to guard. I mean, you move him out to right tackle. Billy Turner's been taking a lot of the reps at left tackle, and I don't think he's been looking good. Now the question there is the Jets D line so good that they're just making these guys look bad in practice? I think Will McDonald was actually a very good
Hmm.
pick. That guy's been making plays in his conference for 5 years now. But overall, they don't super know who the center is. Is it Connor McGovern? Is it Joe Tippmann? And Laken Tomlinson, who's supposed to be like your stalwart, had a terrible year last year. So, I mean, it's a lot of questions. If I was betting, I'd say it would be like Brown, Tomlinson, McGovern, Vera Tucker maybe at tackle, and then you slide Wes Schweitzer in, or whoever loses the Joe Tippmann McGovern battle in at guard. And I don't know if we'll see Becton. I don't know if we'll see Turner on the field that much. And they have Max
Hmm.
Mitchell, who's like a guy. He's like the new Jason Fabini or something. He's like a guy, but he's not going to change the game for you, you
Right.
know? So, long story short, I think they're going to go with as much veteran stuff as possible because Aaron Rodgers is going to want to call that offense. I mean, they hired Nate Hackett to be the OC. Who's calling the plays? It's not going
No.
to be Nate Hackett.
No.
So these veterans are going to have to know all the lingo, all the hand signals, all the butt taps, communication, whatever communication Aaron Rodgers figures out. They got to do it fast, and I'm leaning towards more veteran stuff. Less other teams, you might put a Broderick Jones out there and say, let's let him take his lumps. The Jets are not in a lump taking situation. They have to, and Aaron Rodgers isn't that mobile. If you look at his film from last year, obviously he was hurt. There was a lot of times when he would hold on to the ball and
Hmm.
take a
Hmm.
sack, things that were not necessarily Aaron Rodgers type things to do. And you could say, oh, his guys weren't open or whatever. But long story short, it's not like you have Justin Fields back there. They need to protect this guy. They need to give him time. That's a team that's not going to be doing the QB sneak
No.
probably.
Yeah.
So I mean, they have 10 or 11 guys that you can imagine getting time, like Adam Pankey and Yadni Kajust and all these guys that like are in the mix. They got Tristan Colon from Baltimore. I don't know what the lineup's going to be, and that's a problem. When you look at them all, and you take your Jet fan hat off, and you look at all the other lines, there's not that much uncertainty
Right.
with every other group.
Yeah. Yeah, something to watch again. I mean, this is one where you can get a lot of value out of the training camp reports, and whether there's a 5 they're settled on and the 5 and they're gelling, or that yesterday they tried this, now they're trying this, now they moved this guy over here, now this guy they were counting on is banged up, so we're gonna get to see his backup. And the Jets, I mean, the offensive line play is gonna be huge for that team, like you said, because you're transitioning to this veteran-led system, and it's going to be different, and it's not going to get off the ground if they don't have the personnel to make it work in front of Aaron Rodgers. Um, a lot, a lot of ground to cover. All right, staying with the negative, you know,
Yeah, let's change the subject before I get
yeah,
depressed,
well,
please.
yeah, I understand. It's just hard for Jets fans because it was so long ago, the glory day, I mean, you and I aren't young.
So the last time they were in the playoffs, or was when they were on Hard Knocks, 20 when Rex was talking about getting a stack.
Yeah.
That was
Oh,
2010. That was the last time
it's so
that the Jets
it's
have been in the
so
playoffs.
hard too because that team was so young and they made back-to-back AFC championship games. If the game was 2 minutes longer against the Steelers, they would have won. They would have went to the Super Bowl.
There's a scenario that Jets fans like to talk about. What if Brett Favre stayed
Hmm.
instead of going to Minnesota? Brett Favre probably could have got us over that hump.
Yeah.
But I mean, these are all what ifs, and
Yeah,
can't use
but
nuts.
it's like more than 10 years ago, and that hasn't been anything since then. And then the actual glory day was we're not young, and it was before we were born. You know, uh, it's been a while. The thing that everyone hangs their hat on if you're a Jets fan. But like we said, the Jets and the Mets. It's just yeah. Tell me if I'm making this up. Is there an alignment in like the tri-state area where like if you're a Rangers fan, you're probably a Giants fan and a Yankees fan. And if you're a Mets fan, you're probably like a Jets fan and an Islanders fan. Is that real?
Or Devils, yes, yes. There's absolutely there are some people that you'll run into and they'll be like, "I'm a Yankees, Jets, you know, Rangers fan." You're like, "What's wrong with you?" Like,
Good.
but yeah, 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 more or less. I mean, the Jets are the only team in the NFL without a county to call their
Right.
own, meaning they don't even like Jacksonville has Jacksonville. Like there's no county in the New York, New Jersey area that has more Jets fans than Giants fans. Okay, maybe that'll change this year. We'll see, but that's like according to Facebook or whatever.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like one of those things, man. I also think if we want to get on the conspiracy level thing, there's heroes and villains, and everybody loves to hate a good New York team.
Sure.
Like everybody loves to, especially they're down on prime time 5 times this year. I'm like, oh boy, like game one, the Bills. Like this schedule's very
Hmm.
tough. People like look at last year and this year in a vacuum. Compare the schedules. Like the Jets' early schedule is a
Right.
monster. When Dallas is like your easy game, that's a
Yeah.
problem, like and that's not going to be an easy game. So it's really they're going to be put to the test, and they're going to be on prime time. And I think they'll either make everybody happy in grand fashion or make everybody sad
Right,
in grand
right.
fashion. But it's going to be grand, and it's going to be entertaining for everybody.
Exactly, exactly. It's, some comedy, some tragedy, and a
Yeah, right.
compelling story, no matter what the outcomes of the games are. I mean, that's what you have when you bring in Aaron Rodgers.
Oh, and we'll probably see Zach Wilson at some point. Right
Right,
when you
right,
least
right,
expect
right.
him and least want to see him, there's going to be the return of Zach Wilson
Yeah,
storyline.
absolutely. Well, no, he has to still play in this somehow. His part of the story isn't quite over yet, but yeah. So for the Jets, Mets, Islanders slash Devils fans, well, the Devils are on the upswing, but otherwise, it's rough. It's rough out there. Um, we just got like 10. We're gonna go off the rails here soon, but how about this one? How, because Titus Howard, speaking of right tackles, Titus Howard just got an extension also, 3-year extension. I remember you mentioned Andre Dillard, who got like 8.5 million a year from the Titans. I think Howard got closer to like 20 million a year. Um, and I remember a lot of people thought, oh, the Texans came away from that draft with Howard, and they could have just traded up and gotten Dillard. Well, it worked out. We have to be careful with that, our analysis, or at least be willing to admit when we were wrong. So you have a really good set of tackles. How much can this Texans offensive line help Bobby Slowick's offense get off the ground, help CJ Stroud hit the ground running, and otherwise take what was a fantasy wasteland in terms of offense and actually have at least a few things growing there?
So yeah, Houston is kind of the opposite of the Steelers in a way, in the sense that they have excellent tackles, but the interior is question mark. So Tunsil is Tunsil, assuming he's going to keep being a Pro Bowler. Titus Howard is not quite there at Pro Bowl level, but he's in the conversation as a snub. Right guard, Shaq Mason from Tampa Bay. Juice Scruggs, the rookie from, you know, I think it was Penn State or
Mm-hmm.
Michigan. Not sure which one. I think it might be Michigan
Mm-hmm.
or one of the two. But Kenyon Green is the other guy. Kenyon Green at left guard is the weak point. Basically, you're hoping for a big step up from Green, and you're hoping that Scruggs, who is really more of like a pro ready guy, not a traits guy, can like outplay his scouting report. And you're hoping that Shaq Mason has one more year. But the interior is question marks. But like a lot can be covered up by having Tunsil. Maybe they throw Charlie Heck in at one of the guard positions if there's like a need for it, but I have them as like a middle tier kind of
Yeah.
group. The offensive line helps you most at the edges. It helps you most when you have a really good line and you have to dictate your matchup around that, or a really bad line, and especially if DFS or betting certain matchups. In the middle, a lot of these teams aren't going to make or break you in a way, and if the Texans aren't going to hurt you in any way, assuming they stay healthy, but they're not going to like take over for you at any
Mm-hmm.
point. And also, it happens later in the
Right.
year. Philadelphia being number one helps you when you're in the third round of your playoffs or something, and it's and it's week 18 or something, and it's cold out, and the passing game is kind of grounded because of inclement weather or something like that. Then all of a sudden, these offensive lines become huge.
Yeah. It's funny when you're mentioning Philly too. My brain's bringing back up that you mentioned Darnell Washington as a tackle, and I think, well, if Jordan Mailata has become one of the better tackles in the league, then
Jason
yeah, we're
Peters.
not going to count anything out. Jason Peters, another good name. Where but let's not count any possibilities out when we talk offensive lines. Just a couple more units I want to at least touch on while you're here, and I'm glad that you mentioned DFS too. If you're playing DFS and you don't understand week to week what's going on with offensive line injuries and, like you said, continuity, that's such a big deal with offensive line play. Then you're missing a part of the picture that often explains what happened, especially when it goes badly. Especially whenever you look back and you say, "What happened? I thought this was lined up to be a smash spot and came up empty." There can be, and sometimes it's unforeseeable things like an offensive line injury during the game or something like that. But offensive line play is always part of the story. What part of the Minnesota Vikings story? Now I know Brian O'Neill. Is Brian O'Neill their best offensive line? I mean, one of their best, if not best. I know he's coming back. I want to say off of an Achilles. But what I'm interested in, why bring up the Vikings, Matt, is it's a young offensive line, and it's an offensive line in a offensive scheme that's going to be in its second year now. So there's some convergence there. When you're projecting this offensive line, you're looking at the range of outcomes with that O'Neal injury recovery being a big part of it. How does the Vikings offensive line look?
Yeah, I think I have them like 17th or 18th right now. They return all five starters at all five positions, which the model loves. Um, the real, I like Christian. Let's say what I like first. I like Brian Neal. I really like Christian Darisaw. Like that was a
Yeah.
great pick. Wherever they took him
Hmm.
26th or something, or in the first round, it's a great pick to find a franchise left tackle. He's another Pro Bowl snub type, as long as he stays healthy. But they have the interior is a question mark. Garrett Bradbury's a center again. I mean, everybody in the world wants a change at center if you talk to a Vikings fan. But, bringing back the same guys, Ed Ingram, Ezra Cleveland, I mean, I like the group. It's a good group. Again, better at tackles than an interior, but the interior guards are okay. The center is kind of like your question mark. But overall, like to return all those
Yeah.
guys and have them be a second year in the system, that's an underrated thing, especially when every other line has somebody swapping positions or whatever. That if you're the Jets, you don't even know who three of your positions are going to be,
Yeah.
and you're a week away from the Hall of Fame game.
Yeah. The Vikings thing. Here's how I would put it, Matt. Is if the Vikings come out of the gate hot offensively, uh, maybe it's something that could stick if a big part of that story is the cohesion of the offensive line starting to really pay dividends. The second year in Kevin O'Connell's system, everyone becoming fluent in it. And now, again, I think one of the most important things in fantasy football, I mean, we're talking about drafting right now and who to draft and who not to draft and things, draft strategies. But being able to contextualize in weeks 1 through 4 what are just some strange outlier results and what is a sign that something is a lot different than everybody contemplated, and if you're one of the first people to understand that this is going to stick, that's how you win leagues. Honestly, trades you can make and things like that to take advantage of that, and I'm open to Minnesota being a lot better this year. uh,
So
yeah.
let me give you like a little stat. Looking at my
Uh-huh.
model, there's 8 teams that have the same guys from last year,
Hmm.
or a pipeline guy like who like Will Fries or somebody who's started some of the year. But basically, of those 8 teams, 6 of those teams are in my top 10. The other two are Carolina and
Mm.
Minnesota, and they're at 14 and 18 respectively. And to have that sort of continuity is super underrated.
Yeah. And let's talk about Carolina since that's along with Houston, another team that's going to be blocking for a rookie quarterback. You've got Ike Ekwonu. Loved that from a hometown story. And Brady Christensen has kicked inside to guard Taylor Moton. He's an old hand. Has been through some change there. Um, it sounds like this is an offensive line we should be open to being one of the better offensive lines, even though they aren't known as one right now.
Yeah, I mean, they could be a top 10 offensive line if some of the top 10 experience injuries. As you know, somebody's gonna. But yeah, this is another run heavy group. Taylor Moton at right tackle, he can do both very well, and he's like their bell cow. But all the other guys, Austin Corbett, Bradley Bozeman, Brady, Icky, they're all better running than passing. And with a group like that, you're also thinking about that quarterback run
Hmm.
game again. I could definitely see them just being one of those teams saying, "We got this guy. He's young. He's strong. We're gonna push." And they're not gonna put like bubble wrap on him. And Bozeman got an extension. He's like a really underrated
Yeah.
player to have at center. By the way, he's wasn't the greatest prospect, but really came on as a pro. Baltimore. He's tall. I mean, they have guys. They don't have a ton of like developmental guys. You don't want to see Cam Irving getting snaps or whatever, but the starting five stays healthy. They are an impact group. And I don't think a lot of people know that.
And stressing the run, not a lot of people may be in on Miles Sanders, but maybe Miles Sanders is going to be more of a face of this offense in year one than Bryce Young, especially if that's the strength of the offensive line. And bringing up now, it'll be an interesting question with Bryce Young because he's small. I mean, he's the smallest quarterback that's gone number one. Even I mean, I think as far as like this, the formidity of his build, you're even, is that a word? I don't know. But the point is, I think even,
Yeah, that is a good question.
but
I
go ahead.
it could go either way, right? It could be like Russell Wilson, where the guy is small, but he's like a baseball
Yeah,
shortstop, and he's shifting. He gets lost in the mix. I mean, if you're like if you're doing that scrum sort of thing, you might not even know where the quarterback
yeah,
is. When Josh Allen does it, you know where he
right,
is. I mean, can you stop him or not is the question. But this might be more of a deception
sure.
situation. You're looking at Miles Sanders, you're looking at a pitch or a jet sweep, and boom, everything goes up the
Yeah,
middle
and he's
over
athletic.
Iggy and Brady.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But what I like about your analysis here is there's some, when the Panthers want to win, they can win with their run blocking. Now, how can that translate to something we can? I mean, maybe Chuba Hubbard's the goal line back. Maybe he has like a Jamal Williams kind of year and scores like 15 rushing touchdowns. Something to watch when we know that they have a strong run blocking offensive line. I guess before we turn the page into going off the rails, which really should be the whole show when we hang out. It really should be the whole show. But I don't know if I don't know if they're ready for that. I don't know if people are ready for that.
I'm loving the rails
Yeah,
right now.
right.
I'm riding the
Yeah, yeah.
rails.
You mentioned underrated. Bozeman is an underrated player. You mentioned like Laken Tomlinson had a terrible year. People might not understand that. It seems like even among football fans, I mean, let's face it. Like you said, there's certain football fans that might not even know the names of some of these players. Even among the people who really know the names on the offensive line and are aware of offensive line, you still have a lot of reputation, a lot of stuff where what we understand about offensive line play is just based on reputation, but things can change. So give me something that you think that even some of the more informed football fans don't know about a specific offensive line or a specific team or something that only when you take a closer look does this really emerge when you're watching NFL offensive line play.
Okay, I'll give you a general one and I'll give you a specific one. In general, I'll say most fans aren't aware of how important the O line coach is into this whole
Hmm.
equation. A guy like Dante Scarnecchia, you know, Bill Callahan is running the show in Cleveland, and you're like, okay, well they got Joe Batonio and they got Wyatt Teller, but then they have all these pipeline guys that are coming out of nowhere, like Blake Hance, and he's on another team now or whatever. But like they have all these guys that really get
Hmm.
developed. It's like how Jeff Stoutland develops the Landon Dickerson and develops Jordan Mailata. It's not just drafting Jordan Mailata in the 7th round. It's like developing them. So as time goes on and I get older, I started increasing this score because I realized the weight of it. I realized, it's actually like half a starter. And when I first started doing this, it was like a tenth of a
Hmm.
starter. I was like, it doesn't super matter, but it really does, especially with a guy who has experience. So let's talk about a specific situation, New England.
Mm.
Adrian Clem is coming back into the mix to be the offensive line coach. You have a group there that is actually, I think, the heaviest in football. And then you have I have some of the highest pass blocking grades on these guys. They are an underrated pass blocking group, from Trent Brown to on Waynu at right guard. And it's like, is the heaviness and the size making them harder to get around the edge? Is it just being big? Like, I don't know why it is, but people might look at the New England offensive line and be like, they're not great, but they're actually, 4 out of 5 spots above average. And then Riley Reif or whoever at right tackle will figure it out. But basically, when you're looking at these groups, you have 3 or 4 guys that are above average. You're going to be in the top half of the rankings. Like, 3 stars is enough to get you to the top 10 of these
Right.
rankings. So, I mean, can Trent Brown continue to be Trent Brown? When he's on the field, he appears to
Yeah.
be. I think Michael Onwenu is
So good.
honestly one of the most
Yeah.
underrated
Yeah.
players
Absolutely.
in the whole league. I mean, they had him playing all these different positions. He can play left guard, he can play right tackle, he can play left tackle. They put him in at right guard, but that was like a sweet pick out of Michigan. That was like a really like they take these guys, they take Joe Thuney, and then Joe Thuney becomes like this enormously well-paid guy for
Right.
Kansas City. It's like, who replaces them? Like, they replace them, and they replace them themselves, and then maybe Onwenu goes off and gets an $80 million contract, and they'll just keep
Right.
replacing them. They have a good, like, even the Cole Strange pick. People were like, "Oh, that pick stunk." And the pick was fine. This is like an aggressive unit,
Yeah.
Like, I trust the Patriots scouting department, and I don't have any love for that
Right.
franchise.
Right. It
I
pains
have to
you to
give them
say these
love
things.
too,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's real.
Yeah.
It's not. I'm not like being biased about
Yeah.
it. I have to give the devil his
Yeah.
credit. They're 13th overall in a rating, and they're probably a top 5 pass blocking group. And I'll talk about that in my next article.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's going to be some great articles coming down the pike, and you're also going to get, as part of the training camp reports, you're going to get some of Matt's coverage report update around like week 3 of training camp, just getting you up to date on
Yeah,
everything.
that'll be about the
Yeah,
21st of August, and that's a huge undertaking because I check in with every
yeah.
group to see exactly what's been happening, and there's always
Oh
surprises.
yeah.
There's always my lineup now and my lineup in a month from now. It's going to be different, and I used to feel bad about it, but there's so many like people get
Yep.
hurt, people get moved around, coaches get antsy. Coaches play
Yeah.
favorites. They put guys in
Yep.
doghouses. There's all
Yep.
sorts of stuff happening, and that's the one position where you can kind of get away with it as a
Yeah.
coach. You're not going to be able to like
Right.
swap out your quarterback without the owner and the general manager looking.
That's a great point.
But
There no one, even the owners
no,
don't know. Even the owners are it's somewhat anonymous, the
no,
offensive line play.
unless they've written a big check to that
Right.
person, and
Exactly.
then they get to know them.
Invite them over for
They
dinner.
know who Trent Williams
Yeah,
is.
yeah. No, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. No, this is great stuff. And hey, it's okay that things change because that's why we need people like you in fantasy football is to keep interpreting those changes for us. Okay, off the rails. I guess let's just go back to the uh, we met like 16 years ago on the draft beat, and we've both been around this for a long time. What's one of the first things that jumps to mind when I say, what are your impressions of how, it can be fantasy, it can be the draft community, it can be NFL media, it can be just the fan perceptions of the sport. A lot has changed and changed pretty significantly since we first crossed paths. How do you feel about where things are now going into 2023 season?
So, I mean, I'm generally an optimist, despite my Jets fan sort of
Yeah.
persona. Um, and there have been changes, but I think they've generally been for the
Hmm.
better. There've been a lot of people who would be like, "Oh, they're trying to make the sport soft and this and that," but a lot of the changes they made were for good reasons, and guys were getting hurt, and these are real human beings, and I remember. So to answer your question, I remember when we first started, it being a lot more about the hit stick
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
like let's like I'm gonna truck stick
Yeah.
this guy and I'm gonna like it was like they were Madden kind of creations
Right.
and it was like how can we lay this person out and how can we like almost injure the
Right.
other player, and now it's a lot more like for all across the board. Nobody wants to see anyone go down, and I think that's a good change. I don't like yearn for the days of gladiator NFL when guys were getting chewed up and spit out. They still have shorter careers, but I think they're looking out for player safety more and more. They're not like they're doing everything they can to almost end
Hmm.
kickoffs in a way. Like, there was a whole job description of just being the kickoff crazy person, like the Matt Izzo or whatever. Like I'm
The
just gonna
wedge
be insane
buster.
and run
Yeah.
down the field
Right.
and like
Right.
and that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, and I think it's kind of like enforcers in
Yeah.
hockey. You can always look at it and say it used to be better in a certain way, but I mean, I have a little more empathy for these players or as time goes
Yeah.
on. So I want them to have good lives
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
football. I don't want this to be like for my expense or my entertainment. And that's probably the thing I've personally dealt with the most over the years in one form or another. You get to know these guys, you get to know their families, and then you don't really want to see the replay when the guy
No.
twists his
No.
ankle. You just can't look, and I mean, it's be very interesting to see where the game goes over the years as the years keep going because the demographics keep aging and like will young people obviously the league is always growing. There's people moving into towns. There's a wife who marries a husband who's a Steelers fan and she buys a jersey. Like there's all these
Mhm.
there's immigration. There's all these growth like vectors, but I feel like in general a lot of it's I don't know how much Generation Z is into it, and
Mhm.
I try to I try to tap into that, but I feel like there might be a lacrosse revolution happening or something that
Pickleball.
I'm not in tune with. Maybe TikTok. I'm not in tune with that stuff, and I'm like openly ignorant
Yeah.
about it. I've gotten to the point where I just like, yeah, good luck with that. I'm like leaning into. I listen to like Grant Random on Lithium all day long. Listen to '90s
Uh-huh.
songs because that's what I know.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, the 90s. I just went to see The Far Side last night, you know? S
Oh my gosh! I mean, we could go. Oh, that's amazing. I mean, I would love that show, but that's like, I'll go see Everclear at the casino or something.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like I don't. It doesn't even have to be like good '90s. It could be
Because
like
it
anything.
'cause it reminds
I'll be
you
like, I heard that
It
song.
reminds you I think there's a lot of '90s nostalgia because it was the last time, at least well, it depends on what age you are, right? But for people our age, the '90s felt like, well, everything's gonna be okay forever, right? Everything's just gonna be like this
It was the
forever.
last time before the internet was like super
Yeah.
widespread and everybody had like cameras in their pockets. I mean, it's kind of old now, but there was this Woodstock '99 documentary on
Ugh.
Netflix, which was like they burnt the whole
Yeah.
place down. Remember
Uh-huh.
pyros? Like, remember like every group had like a friend who was like, well, don't let Joe next to the matches. And it was like, what were you doing? You were just lighting fires for entertainment, and it was like a thing. And now I don't think kids understand quite how exciting that was for us to have open fires. Like it was just,
But just to be
I
in the
don't know.
world, not to have a layer between you and the world, and, have all these things happen real time, and, I mean, there's also another layer to it too, where I think and this is, varies from person to person, family to family. I mean, our generation, we kinda raised ourselves. We certainly had a lot. I think now parents I mean, as a parent, I'll say, like, you manage your kid's life a lot more than our lives were managed, or most of our lives were managed. There's a lot more awareness of all the stuff.
There was a
Mhm.
commercial. Do you know where your kids are? It's 10 o'clock. That was a real
Yeah.
commercial. It was like, like oh shoot, it is 10 o'clock. Maybe I should see if Joey's
Right.
in the
Well,
house. I haven't seen him all day.
and I hear things like parents are really, really careful and reluctant about, like, sleepovers now, and it's like, yeah, like, our parents didn't even know whose house we were all sleeping over at. We were it's like, but they knew we were at someone's
Yeah,
house. They don't even know which house
I'm
we
at
were at.
Sig's house. Sig's at my house,
Exactly.
and neither of us are
And
there.
we're actually out with our backpacks in the middle of the night exploring, an abandoned coal
Yeah,
mine. Real story, true story.
a creek
Yeah.
where somebody saw a dead body of a
Exactly,
bird or something.
exactly, exactly. See, this
Yeah.
is what we're nostalgic for. This is exactly what we're nostalgic for. It's good though. It makes you smile, but at the same time, there's at least there's something to look back on that makes us feel that more
I
fuzzy
mean,
feeling.
I'm more nostalgic for the
Yeah,
feeling of being a kid
exactly.
when not having to worry where the hot water is coming from out of the hot water heater.
Right.
Like now, these things are my
Well,
responsibility
that's
as an
true
adult,
too. We had no idea.
But I remember the feeling of just being like, well, I'm eating food and I'm consuming electricity, and none of this
Right.
concerns me in any
Right.
way. Maybe I'll take a bath later. Like and now, it's like, have we redone the
Yeah.
bathroom in the last 10 years and updated the
Yeah.
fixtures? It's like, oh
Exactly. There's interest rates. I mean, the first time I remember having
man,
a
yeah.
conversation about mortgage interest rates, like, oh wow, these things happen. Like, there's not a sign that you pass like on the highway that says you are now becoming old or your parents or whatever. It just happens. You just hear the stuff come out of your mouth in your own voice. You're like, did I actually just say that?
So this is like old man yells at clouds. My first
Uh-huh.
job was pumping gas for the Hess
Oh,
Corporation, which was at that point Leon Hess owned the
right.
Jets. So this was the '90s, and I could have had any summer job. I mean, you have a summer
Yeah.
job, and it was like, oh, we'll hire you for 2 or 3 months at the mall. I could have worked at the record store. I could have worked anywhere. I chose to pump gas because I wanted to somehow support the
Yeah.
Jets, and they had this closet which would have all the uniforms. You'd go in, you'd get like your extra large white pants for the day and your extra large white shirt, and next thing you know, you'd be squeegeeing people's like that's come on, man. And this was like back when before robots were so you'd have to key the gas to like
Hmm.
reset it, and I have this big wad of cash, and like if you ever came up at $20 short, it was like the worst day. Like
That was a lot of money back then. $20.
oh, that was actually my desire was I just want to handle the money. It was like I just want to know what it felt like to have $500 in
Sure.
20s in my pocket.
Sure. Sure. Well, Matt Bitonti and all the other football guy staff, they're going to help you handle the money, have bigger wads in your pocket, or otherwise have bragging rights, all those things. It's fantasy football season. Everybody's back. The training camp fire hose is on. Again, we got the daily newsletter to make a little cocktail out of that goes down easy. We have the training camp reports. We got rankings, articles, all kinds of good stuff for all you football crazed people out there. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to do this. You're the best. We love you because
You are
uh,
sick. You're the
ah,
best.
we're all the best.